Today is probably one of my most favorite days of this whole tour. This is starting the night before. We ended that day in an upper room in the old city of Jerusalem. In the scriptures, it talks about Jesus having his Last Supper with his disciples within an upper room. This is a Byzantine representation of that room. Jesus left with his disciples from this upper room across the Kidron Valley. There's the upper room, and then right down here below is the Kidron Valley. We're seeing a Jewish cemetery right here below on the Mount of Olives, and across the way is a Turkish cemetery right in front of the Gate Beautiful. So we come to the Church of All Nations on the Mount of Olives near the Garden of Gethsemane. This church was built by the funds donated from many nations in the early 1900s. It is placed near the traditional spot of the Garden of Gethsemane and commemorates the prayer or the suffering that Jesus went through there at that garden. The courtyard is pretty neat. Some different sculptures, as well as some of the oldest olive trees in Jerusalem, are found here. Even though they look old, they are only about 20 centuries old, not hundreds of centuries old. Christ was then arrested near the Garden of Gethsemane and taken to the palace of Caiaphas, the high priest. This is a church built upon the palace of Caiaphas, and this place was very interesting. Our guide had given us an example of where Jesus was arrested at and how he would have come to this place. There is a set of stone stairs that dates back to the 1st century that Christ could have walked upon. There's also many other ruins found at this location. There is a dungeon in the basement of the church that dates back to the 1st century as well. Our guide has given us an example of how people would have been beaten, where Christ could have been tied and beaten here. We also have an amazing view over the valley, looking out on residential areas of Jerusalem. Again, notice they're all built out of that Jerusalem limestone. And right there, that brown area, again, is the Jewish cemetery. And there's the Old City. We then enter the Old City, and it is the Muslims' day of prayer. Quite a busy place to be. Very rainy today as well. Enjoy the view here of the streets. There was so much produce and food being sold on this day. We walk the streets to the place of Antonia's Fortress, and that is where Pilate would have been residing and where Jesus would have been brought before him. These are tunnels that are found under the current city where the Antonia Fortress was built. They don't date back to the 1st century. It's believed that there are still remains underneath of this. As we leave the Antonia Fortress, we re-enter the city streets. Again, it's a Muslim's day of prayer, a super busy day.
أقبل علبة بسكوت ب5 علبة بسكوت ب5 مال الهدايا ب5 على البلاش على الداخلي يا شباب يلا على البلاش فرح الولد فرح البنت 4 حبات كسر ب10 4 رياح ثلاثة مكسر ب10 السكر 7 ب10 كيس حلو مشكل ب10
As we leave the city, we leave through the Damascus Gate. Outside the city, along this road, is a garden tomb. And this tomb was discovered in the late 1800s. The landowner was wanting to excavate, and that is when he discovered the tomb. And the tomb was discovered first, and then the wine press. The interesting facts with this is it was very close to a hill with a skull. And here the guide at the Garden Tomb is showing us where we are located compared to the old city and where the road of Damascus is. And outside that city wall is this hill, which is a place of death where stoning would have occurred. And it's also very near a road. And in Hebrew, the name would have been Golgotha for the place of the skull, or Latin, Calvary. This picture shows an example of the road as well as the place of skull.
There's a spout here. The juice from the grapes would have flowed into here to ferment and would have been scooped out down here. Scripture tells us in John 19:41 that in the place where Christ was crucified there was a nearby garden, and in that garden there was a tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So all of this scenario fits that scripture. So we have a place of execution, and nearby we have a garden, and in that garden there is a tomb.
The filling of the garden tomb was so different than the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This place just feels right. The whole day felt right. I believed some of the places I was seeing really, truly were places that Jesus had been. That evening we went to the BYU Jerusalem Center, and we were able to listen to a concert there while overlooking the valley. The next day was the Sabbath, and we went back to the Jerusalem Center. We were able to look at the wine press or oil press they have there on site. We also went back to the Mount of Olives, to another garden of olive trees. We had a nice dinner at an Arabic restaurant where we finally were able to have some lamb.